God bless everybody. It's October 3rd of 2021, and I'm going to address an extremely controversial subject that I do not believe the church has a full understanding of. I've been asking this question for a few years now, and no one seems to have an answer for me. So I'd like to address this in the manner that I understand it and believe that it basically brings us into everything that I've been talking about and why we have to understand who the players are in the end days. And I wrote this actually as a letter, email to a person as a question, and so I wanted to pose this to the community and get some insight and feedback on this specific question. I believe this is one of the keys to understanding why Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is not, I said, is not the same as Gog of Revelation 20, Satan, or Antichrist. That Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is the white horseman or the first seal in Revelation, and that Antichrist, as I've stated in many of my articles, does not come up until the sixth trumpet. After the bottomless pit opens on the fifth trumpet, we see the sixth trumpet happen, and Satan comes down from heaven and brings forth the Antichrist and the false prophet. And if you believe that Revelation is a chronological book of 22 chapters, and I've cut out three additional visions that John has, and I've showed you where those breaks are in the 22 chapters and why the book is chronological in my 117-step timeline, that if you break those three additional visions out, it is a chronological thing. And so if you look at the book of Revelation, you will understand that you will see 7 seals happen first, followed by 7 trumpets, and then they're followed by the wrath of God, which are the 7 bowls. Now, a lot of people like to overlap these things, but when it clearly tells you in one verse, actually 2 verses, in Revelation 8:1 and 2, that when the 7th seal is broken, which means all 7 seals have been broken at that time, that he basically hands out the 7 trumpets, and then they go forth and sound. That the 7 seals happen prior, then we have the 7 trumpets happen, and then the last phase are the 7 bowls of God's wrath, which happens in Revelation 15:1. So if you go out and look at my article about the 3 woes and the 3 trumps, this explains how the breakdown of the 22 chapters happens. And then from that warning in Revelation 8:13, it basically tells us in that warning that we need to watch the last 3 trumpets, the 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpet. Why? The 5th trumpet is when the bottomless pit opens. The 6th trumpet is when Antichrist arises with the false prophet. And the 7th trumpet is when the Lord comes back and the rapture happens shortly after that. So this is extremely important. When you see the 22 chapters of Revelation, that you'll see the 5th, 6th, and 7th trump reoccurring constantly. I've explained how that happens in that article and video about the 3 woes and the 3 trumps. So if you don't understand that, you need to go stop the video now, go look at that, and see how the breakdown of Revelation and the 22 chapters occur. This gives us a verse-by-verse timeline, and each of these 117 steps I've produced on this timeline have an attached verse that you can follow directly in the Bible. So you can go from Revelation chapter 1 through to chapter 22, see all of the steps, and also then realize that if you break out these 3 additional visions that John has, one of the elect, or the 144,000, one of the nations and the peoples, and one of Mystery Babylon, that if you break these three additional visions out, that it is a chronological book and gives us great insight to what is coming up in the next 6 years. But one thing that I've been trying to explain is I believe the key to understanding that Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is not destroyed in the same manner as Satan or Antichrist, or Gog of Revelation 20, which is Satan. Okay, so when you think of Satan, you also have to think of him as Gog of Revelation 20, because he's released and then he goes out and deceives the nations at the end. So realize that Gog of Revelation 20 is the same as Satan. But Satan is controlling Antichrist during the end days on the ground here. And so we need to distinguish that they're two different people or individuals or beings. And so Satan is not Antichrist. Antichrist and the false prophet are being controlled by Satan after he's being expelled from heaven itself. But the key to understanding of these three major players, Gog, Ezekiel 38:39, Revelation 20, Gog, or Satan, which is the same thing, and Antichrist, is that Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is destroyed with his armies and then buried in a dirt grave for 7 months. This is an extremely important statement and profound in the sense that Antichrist and Satan are never buried in a dirt grave. In Revelation 16 and 20, Antichrist is thrown in the lake of fire and not buried in a dirt grave. Now, some will say, well, when the three frogs come out of their mouths, they're dead bodies on the ground, and so those could have been buried. But then you're saying that you're going to have 7 months of burials with 7 years after that, which is not in consistent teaching with the length of Armageddon, which is a shorter period of time than 7 years. If you take the Battle of Armageddon, which is the sixth bull at the very end, that in my opinion, is not a 7-year period between the sixth and seventh bull. So if you're talking about tribulation, great tribulation, in that 7-year period, that would be at the time of the signing of the treaty with the nations to the time the Lord comes back. And remember, he does shorten that second half. So it is not a full 7-year period. He tells you he has to shorten the second half or none of his elect will survive. So I've showed you that in my timeline and my different diagrams of my flow charts and things like that on how that's shortened and why it's shortened and how the 1335 days affects the second portion of tribulation into great tribulation. But let's get back to why Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is buried in a dirt grave when Antichrist and Satan is not. And why in Revelation 16 and 20, Antichrist is thrown in a lake of fire, and also Satan is thrown in the lake of fire in Revelation 20. So you can see that there's a problem or conflict in the destruction of these three individuals or creatures or beings. One is buried clearly in a dirt grave, and two are thrown in the lake of fire, and there's a reason for this. And it also then distinguishes that Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is not Antichrist or Satan, and that he is potentially a leader of a country that's going to bring a quarter of the world into war and then die. And we're going to sort of explain how that happens as we move forward. Now, in Revelation 20, the armies, and I think this is extremely, extremely important, In Gog of Ezekiel 38:39, the armies that are destroyed with Gog are buried. But in Revelation 20, these armies that join Satan, or Gog of Revelation 20, which is not the same as Gog of Ezekiel 38:39, are consumed by God's hand by fire. They're consumed on the spot. They never buried them, and one of the reasons they're consumed on the spot is if they're in Revelation 20, we've had the rapture and we are now spiritual beings in heaven and with God, and that through the millennial 1,000 years at the end, when Satan is released and goes out and deceives these people or these beings, these elect, martyrs, and chosen one of God that actually do fall at the very end after the 1,000 years is up, they will actually be consumed by fire from God's hand. They're never buried in a grave. They're consumed by fire to the point where they're just eradicated and removed completely from existence. And it clearly tells us in Revelation 20 that they will never have the second death. And the second death is because they will never be judged in the book of life and never be given not given the choice, but they will be made to either be thrown in the lake of fire or given the ability to have the eternity with God. And so they will never have they will never be placed in that situation where they're actually judged in the book of life itself. They're consumed directly by God through his hand of fire. And I figure that if God has found that his chosen have failed him at the very end after 1,000 years of being with his son on this, in heaven before we come to the earth and join with the earth as the kingdom sets down, that God isn't going to waste his time with them anymore, and he's going to vanquish them and not judge them, because at that point they've just failed. And very few of his elect will fail, but some will at the end. It tells us clearly that some will fail at the very end and they'll be deceived. But these people, these individuals, these beings, these spiritual beings in heaven will not be consumed or be buried in a dirt grave like they are here, okay? It also tells us that the weapons and fuels be burnt for 7 years. So to me, this alludes to prior to tribulation, great tribulation, and that this is on the ground, on the earth, and this will be what I call a pre-seals war. And what I mean by that is, if Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is the white horseman, or the first seal that's released, and he brings forth the next 3 horsemen, peace taken from the earth, famine, destruction, disease, and then death, with Hades and hell following him, which means the bottomless pit is following Gog, potentially moving hell with him to that resurrection event that I talk about in Isaiah 14, how Gog of Ezekiel will die and be buried and then be resurrected into Antichrist. And I know that's a pretty out there concept, that Antichrist might not just be a man, that he might be a supernatural nightmare on this planet, as Satan is being thrown from heaven with a third of the angels and impregnating all these dead bodies that are buried in these graves, and then bringing forth supernatural beings upon this planet. I know that's pretty far out there, but that's what the Bible's saying, and so I'm going to go with what the Bible's telling me. And in Isaiah 14 clearly tells you multiple times that this is going to happen in this manner. So you can go read that, and I've done an article on Isaiah 14. You can go look at that. So if these armies in Revelation 20 are consumed by God's hand in fire and Satan is thrown in the lake of fire, then he's never buried. Also, in the Antichrist condition, he in Revelation 16, when the three frogs come out of the mouths, from the transition of 16 to 20, what happens? The false prophet and the false prophet and Antichrist are thrown in the lake of fire. And then at the end of 20, when Satan is released and he is then, the armies are consumed by fire, what happens to Satan in Revelation 20? He is thrown in the lake of fire where Antichrist and the false prophet already are. It clearly says that. If you go look at that in Revelation 20, Satan is thrown in the lake of fire where Antichrist and the false prophet already are. So they are not buried. They're not buried in a dirt grave. And so why is Gog of Ezekiel 38-39 buried in this dirt grave when all these other players are thrown in the lake of fire or destroyed in the lake of fire by God himself, to basically committed to eternity in this pool of hell? I think this is an extremely important question. I do not believe that most people can answer this distinction between these three characters and why this is occurring. And a lot of people, the main emphasis that I struggle with today is why Gog of Ezekiel 38-39 is Antichrist. So everybody seems to agree, except me, which is amazing. Maybe I'm the wrong one in the room, but Antichrist somehow is the first seal. But if you take the chronological effect of the 22 chapters, and the 7 seals are first, then the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls, and if you believe in that lineage of how this occurs within the Bible itself, then you'll realize that the first seal can't be Antichrist because he comes up on the 6th trumpet. How can he be the white horseman on the first seal? That's years down the road. And the white horseman dies, and if he's Gog of Ezekiel 38 and 39, as I've ascertained based on my studies and what I've shown you, that Ezekiel 38 and 39 is actually the white horseman, or the first seal, that he will die on the 6th seal by the wrath of the Lamb in 6:16. And that should be fairly easy to see, because if you open the first seal and the white horseman comes out, which is Erdogan of Turkey and the nation of Turkey, which is going to consume a quarter of the Middle East into war, and bring 10 nations against Israel, that on 6:16 in the wrath of the Lamb, we would see all those nations die. And what happens prior to that? The martyrs in seal 5 say, look, we've had all this destruction upon us. When are you going to fix this? And he clearly opens all those seals, and on the 6th seal, we see a destruction of all these nations, all these armies, and basically they bury these nations for 7 months, and they burn those fuels for 7 years, alluding to it being a pre-seals war prior to tribulation and actual Antichrist even showing up. From this destruction of Gog of Ezekiel 38-39, we will see what I call Isaiah 14 occur. Revelation 13 says the same thing. Satan will be thrown from heaven, cast to the earth. Woe to the earth, because now he is on the ground among you, and he's not in heaven anymore, and he will never be in heaven again, because basically God says that he's expelled him for good, and now he is on the ground, and we are going to go through this tribulation, great tribulation period of or 1,260 days, or 3.5 years, or 42 months of having Antichrist on the ground between the signing of the treaty and abomination of desecration. So we need to look at these distinctions. It's extremely important why one was buried, the other two are thrown in the lake of fire. So, as I said, if you look at Revelation 20, Satan, which are joined by those fallen elect, or the people that join him and go against the armies of the saints, they are consumed by God's hand by fire, never buried. And then Satan is thrown in the lake of fire just after this, and there is no 7-year gap that I can tell. So if you're trying to allude that at the end of Gog 20, when Satan is thrown in the lake of fire, there's a 7-year period. That doesn't make any sense. Number one, they're not buried. And at the end, it clearly says that right after that, heaven comes and joins earth, and the books are opened, and everybody's judged, and the dead in the sea, earth, and in hell are raised up, and all people are judged and either gain access to eternity or thrown in a lake of fire. So there's not a 7-year gap there. Some people could say, well, when the 3 frogs come across from the east and they're expelled from the bodies of Antichrist, Satan, and the false prophet, that these dead bodies will somehow be buried for 7 years and the fuels will be burned during Armageddon at the very end, and that's a 7-year period. So that means that the 6th bowl and the 7th bowl, the gap between those 2 periods is 7 years. And I don't agree with that. So that doesn't make any sense either. So when actually does the War of Gog of Ezekiel 38-39 start? And why are these bodies buried for 7 months and alluding to clearly a 7-year period, which alludes to the time of tribulation and great tribulation when Antichrist is on the ground? Why Gog of Ezekiel 38-39 is not Antichrist or Satan when he's buried and neither of these other two are. So, if God consumes these people in Revelation 20 by fire, they're never buried. Satan clearly is thrown in the lake of fire at the end in Revelation 20. And Antichrist in Revelation 16 and in 20, because there's a gap. You have the Mystery Babylon vision between 16 and 20. 17, 18, and 19 is all about Mystery Babylon and John's third vision. You got to cut those out. But if you go from 16 to 20, what happens? Armageddon happens in the 6th bowl. The 3 frogs come out of the mouth. Antichrist and false prophet are thrown in a lake of fire. The 7th bowl drops, cleanses the planet. Satan is bound, released after the 1,000 years is over, because we're already raptured. We're raptured during the 7th trumpet, so we're already in heaven with the Lord. The 7th bowl happens, the earth's cleansed. But as we're in heaven for the 1,000 years, at the end, Satan is released. We're spiritual beings because we're not flesh anymore. The flesh bodies have gone away. And we walk into the 1,000-year millennial, where at the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is thrown in the lake of fire where Antichrist and the false prophet already are from Revelation 16. So unless they're burying those bodies of where the 3 frogs came out for 7 months with those armies in Armageddon, and that lasts for up to 7 years, where they burn the weapons and fuels, that doesn't make any sense. Because then you're saying that between the 6th bowl and the seventh bowl, that's a 7-year period. And I don't agree with that because it's a day of God's wrath, and that's a short period of time. About 10 to 15 days, depending on how you interpret that. If you go with the fall feasts, between the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur, and the Tabernacles, it's about 10 days between the Feast of Trumpets and Yom Kippur. So you could make that argument, or it could be if you take 1,000 years as one day of God and you take that as an hour of God's wrath, that's about 15 days. So you can equate it down both ways. But it's about 10 to 15 days, depending on how you look at it. So the question has always arose to me, and this is how I tried to frame it to the community, is why is Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 not Satan or Antichrist? And if Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is a white horse leader that brings a quarter of the world, the Middle East, into war, then we're going to see this occur prior to tribulation, and we're going to see a destruction of all of these armies, at least the majority of them. There will be a residue left around Jerusalem and Israel, so there will be constant warring that occurs for years after that destruction. But in general, it clearly says that these armies will be destroyed and buried in a grave called Ham Gog in northern Israel. And so we have to look at that distinction and discern why that occurs. And then when someone says, look, Satan or Antichrist is Gog of Ezekiel 38:39, that is not right. He's not Gog of Revelation 20, he's not Satan, or he's not Antichrist. Ezekiel 38:39 is its own player, he's his own individual, and he's buried. That is the biggest distinction between why these players are not the same, and I think we need to look at that angle. I would like to get feedback from the community on why these three players are different, and explain to me why Gog of Ezekiel 38:39, which seems to be a Main Street teaching out here, is an Antichrist when they both clearly have different demises. I can't logically follow this argument. So I'm trying to bring this up as a topic so people can understand. Look, you need to look at these different things. And the biggest one is why one is buried and the others are consumed by either God's hand by fire or thrown in a lake of fire. There's only one buried, and that is Gog of Ezekiel 38:39. I say that's the white horseman, the first seal. He's the one that's going to be the catalyst that's going to bring the world into tribulation. But this Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is not the same as Satan or Gog of Revelation 20 or Antichrist, because they all have a different demise by being thrown in a lake of fire. So if we discern that Gog of Ezekiel 38:39 is actually the white horseman, and if you go into Ezekiel 38:39, you'll clearly understand that God has knocked the bow and arrows out of his hand, that he is going to destroy these armies, and he's alluding to that white horseman with the bow. And some say he doesn't have arrows, but I don't know a warrior that takes over a quarter of the world without arrows in his quiver. So just showing that he doesn't have arrows or saying that he doesn't have arrows in his bow doesn't mean that that isn't occurring and that he's not going to bring major conflict upon this planet. So I don't agree with that. Some people will say because he only has a bow, this is a man of peace, or he's shooting arrows that don't matter somehow. when it clearly says that he's going to bring a quarter of the planet or 2 billion people in distress. I'm guessing that's probably not the best way to look at that. So I've said for a while, I believe Gog of Ezekiel 38, 39 are the 10 toes of the iron and clay that will not mix, that this is the Muslim radical nations at the end that will go against Israel just prior to the tribulation and the rise of Antichrist. And the seventh kingdom, which is the Ottoman Empire, if you look at Nebuchadnezzar's statue, the feet of the clay and iron that won't mix, at the very end, you have the 10 toes, which are the 10 nations of Gog that go against Israel. They will be destroyed. And then what happens? We have the eighth beast kingdom arise. And I've said for a while that I do not believe the seventh kingdom was destroyed in World War I. The Ottoman Empire never has gone away, and Erdogan is going to revive the Ottoman Empire by 2023, as he's indicated, which will be the centurion mark of the Ottoman Empire when it was destroyed or basically removed from power in World War I. So in 1923, that occurred, and so 100 years later, we're going to see this Ottoman Empire revamped. And if you look at the chart that I had shown you on my timeline flow charts, you'll realize that we are walking into this 6-year period where this is all going to start to occur. So God bless everybody. Be safe. Please look at these different aspects of Gog of Ezekiel 38, 39, and why he is a completely different player than Gog of Revelation, which is the same as Satan, or Antichrist, which die completely different by being thrown in a lake of fire and not buried. And so I think once we understand that, this could change the way we look at how we perceive Antichrist. And if we think that Antichrist is the first seal, then you need to explain to me why, if you believe it's a chronological book and he rises on the sixth trumpet, how he rises twice. Because that means you're telling me that he rises on the first seal, and then somehow when the pit opens on the fifth trumpet, he rises again on the sixth trumpet. Doesn't make logical sense either. And that means that you're overlapping the seals over the trumpets over the bowls. And a lot of people are doing that. So I think, though, if you looked at my articles and you realize that I can break those teachings within 1 or 2 verses most of the time, you realize that that's just wrong. And all you have to do is look at one example, Revelation 8, 1 and 2, and that clearly tells you 7 seals are first, and then 7 trumpets, and then when you get to Revelation 15:1, we see the 7 bowls. And so it is chronological. The 7 seals happen first, 7 trumpets, and then 7 bowls. And so the first seal can't be the 6th trumpet, which is what a lot of these teachers are telling me is the 6th trumpet, which is the Antichrist rising with the false prophet, is the same as the first seal. And that just can't be right if it's a chronological book. So God bless everybody. Have a great day. Be safe out there. Things are moving quickly. We have a potential global market crash by the end of the month, end of the year. You know, it's coming. There's going to be a major correction. So keep your eye on everything. Put a little oil in your lamp. Put some food in your home. Keep some extra water. Flu season's coming in, and it's going to start to get cold. So just protect your loved ones. God bless everybody, and have a great day.